No one expected an ordinary morning to become the trigger that unearthed memories long buried. The air was chilly, the wind slipping through the old Lincoln barracks, once a military base, now repurposed as a community training center for local youth. The flagpoles still stood silently, their paint faded with time, and each brick underfoot carried the rough breath of a past most had chosen to forget. Officer Thomas Daniels, a former military officer now overseeing site security, walked slowly along the administrative corridor. Beside him padded Dante, an old, retired canine dog who still accompanied Daniels like an inseparable part of his life. Dante was no longer the agile warrior he once was. Patches of his back were graying, but his eyes, sharp amber like cold steel, retained the same instinct Daniels had always trusted. "Let's swing by the command room," Daniels said, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. That room, once a hub of strategic coordination for over 3 decades, was now used for community meetings, occasional first aid training, or survival workshops. Everyone assumed it had become just a space, stripped of memory. But Dante didn't think so. The moment they stepped inside, Dante froze. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not loud but sharp and heavy, like the snap of a switch. Daniel stopped and turned. "What is it, old boy?" No reply, of course. But Dante's gaze was locked on one point in the room, the old American flag hanging on the east wall. It was slightly crooked, hastily hung perhaps, its fabric frayed at the edges, yet it held a solemnity no one dared disturb. That flag had once been hoisted by Colonel Harold Carroll, a legend of the base, on the day the campaign ended in 1975. Dante moved toward it. Not walked, crept. Every step is tense and deliberate, like an old soldier sweeping for mines. The fur along his back bristled, every muscle coiled, and then, bark! A thunderous bark split the air, sharp, piercing, like it tore a hole in time itself. Before anyone could react, Dante leaped, powerful and precise. His front paws slammed against the wall, jaws clamped down on the flag's lower edge, and he yanked, hard. The sound of ripping fabric slashed through the air. A piece of the flag fell away, revealing something behind it. Everyone in the room froze. A chair toppled. A child screamed. The assistant dropped her paperwork. Someone moved to restrain Dante, but Daniels raised his hand, stopping them. His eyes never left the dog, who now stood rigid, growling lowly, eyes fixed on the torn spot behind the flag. Daniels stepped forward. He knelt where Dante had bitten. Behind the fabric wasn't concrete, as expected. Instead, a gray metal panel was embedded into the wall, scratched, dulled by time, with a small, rusted steel handle barely visible, the kind designed to be hidden. A voice called from the back. "What is that?" Daniels didn't answer. Dante growled again, softer this time, almost like a breath. He stepped back 2 paces and sat, the way he used to when guarding, eyes still locked on the handle, as if waiting for a command. No one in that room knew it yet, but at that moment, when a dog went from the battlefield, remembered the sound of war, tore through a flag, and opened a passage to a forgotten history, that was the beginning of a story that would change how America saw itself forever. As the shredded fabric slid down, the air in the room thickened. Every eye turned to the newly exposed wall behind the American flag Dante had just torn apart. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that choked in your throat, as if time itself paused, waiting for something ancient to return. Daniels exhaled softly, approaching slowly, each step as if treading on a past long forbidden. The overhead fluorescent light flickered faintly. When he reached the wall, he knelt, one hand resting lightly on Dante's collar, the other slipping past the torn cloth to touch the cold metal beneath. The steel surface was coarse, some areas deeply corroded by time and moisture, but still oddly solid. At its center was a small, round brass handle, the kind used in old military bunkers or storage vaults. It didn't protrude. It was expertly embedded into a recess in the brickwork, invisible unless the flag was removed. Someone, long ago, had deliberately hidden it behind a national symbol. Dante growled softly. Daniels glanced sideways. The dog stood taut beside him, ears high, back rigid, eyes locked on the handle. Daniels had seen this behavior before, in Syria when Dante detected an ammo cache door laced with the scent of explosives. But this time, there was no scent of powder, only something the human eye couldn't detect. "Get the tools," Daniels said quietly to a technician behind him. No panic. He didn't believe this was a physical threat. The danger here was something invisible, something Dante had sensed before anyone else. When the handle was pulled, a soft click broke the silence. The sound of old metal finally stirred after decades. The door creaked open just a sliver, letting a thin beam of yellowish light leak through, like water seeping from a cracked wall. Daniels raised a flashlight, peering inside, and slowly pushed the door wider. The hinges groaned, a strangled, rusty cry, revealing the space within inch by inch. It wasn't a storage room. Not an electrical closet, nor a medical supply unit as some had guessed. It was a deliberately built chamber, about 3 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, just big enough for one person to work or observe. The walls were lined with dark gray acoustic padding. On the ceiling hung old fluorescent tubes, some still faintly flickering, as if clinging to their final charge. There were no windows, no vents. The air inside was stifling. Step over the threshold and you could smell time itself, rusted metal, old paper, and something faintly like bleach. Dante didn't enter immediately. He stood at the doorway, nose lifted, sniffing, then slowly bowed his head, touching his nose gently to the floor. Daniels followed his gaze. There, faint and nearly blended into the concrete, was a dark streak. He knelt, scanning with the flashlight. Beneath the dust, a trace of long-dried blood, a drag mark. Small but long. He said nothing, only placed his hand on Dante's neck and gave it a slight squeeze. A silent thank you. It was Dante who had smelled it, something time hadn't completely buried. Inside the room, what remained was chilling. A bare metal table at the center, atop it a reel-to-reel tape recorder, the kind used in military data analysis in the 60s and 70s. The tape had slipped free, a loop of it clinging to the table edge, dusty and torn. In the corner, a wooden bulletin board held faded pencil notes, most barely legible, only hints of cryptic terms like TS.9, Echo Pattern 3B, or Cycle Reset Pending. Daniel swept his flashlight left. There stood a low bookshelf with a single row of dark brown folders, each labeled with shaky handwriting. One box had slipped forward, lid ajar. Inside were crayon drawings, clearly by a child. One stopped him in his tracks. A man in a long coat, holding a clipboard, with a black and white dog beside him, tail curled like a crescent moon. Dante had stepped inside now, silently standing just a few feet from that drawing. Daniels hadn't called him, but the dog had moved, drawn by instinct. He sat by the image, head bowed, eyes steady and unblinking. A young soldier behind them moved to enter, but Daniels stopped him. "Let him be," he said softly, as if afraid to shatter the fragile atmosphere. And in that moment, inside a dust-covered room of forgotten records, under the dim flicker of a dying century, with loyalty stronger than any command, Daniels understood. It wasn't humans who first remembered this place. It was Dante. The door hadn't just opened to a room. It cracked open a fault line in history. And it was a dog, thought to be done with war, who dared to knock first. No one spoke for a moment, no questions, no orders, not even a glance was exchanged among the rapid response team members standing just outside, because what filled the room now wasn't fear. It was a different kind of silence, thick, tense, as if the very space had just realized it was being awakened from a centuries-long sleep. Dante was the only one moving. No more growling, no more lunging. The dog now stood still in the corner of the room, every fiber of his body taut, amber eyes locked on something in the far left shadow where Daniel's flashlight had yet to reach. Dante tilted his head slightly, ears perked, and from deep in his throat came a low, compressed sound. Not a warning, but an instinctive response to something beyond human understanding. Daniel stopped. He didn't rush to the corner. He had seen Dante react like this before, not to a sound, not to a scent, but to a presence. Something that humans couldn't label, but Dante could. Like that time in Basra, when the dog stood frozen, staring at a patch of cement wall for 2 minutes, until they discovered an arsenal buried 30 centimeters behind it. It wasn't mere attachment that made Daniels keep Dante around, even in retirement. It was trust. The kind of trust earned by a being who had never betrayed him, even when those in power had already forgotten him. Daniels moved slowly towards the corner where Dante stared, sweeping the flashlight beam across each shadowed patch, like reading the blurred lines of an old poem. There, near the end of the wall, beneath a heavy metal cabinet, was a patch of peeling black paint shaped like an L, right next to a faint, nearly erased line of text. TS Unit, Cycle 3A. Daniels froze. TS, he murmured. That code had appeared in classified wartime records he'd reviewed in military archives, a designation for high-level psychological experiment units, usually buried beneath administrative files or sometimes absent from any official archive altogether. Dante stepped forward half a pace, his nose pressed near a cracked tile. He sniffed repeatedly, his tongue darting out carefully, like tasting an old memory. Daniels knelt, brushing off the fine dust clinging to the base of the wall. Immediately, he felt the tiles dip, uneven with the rest. Scraping lightly with a gloved finger, he uncovered a thin sheet of metal beneath. A panel. No handle, no hinges. But possibly a secondary door? "What do you smell?" Daniels whispered, like speaking to a comrade, not a dog. Dante didn't turn, just exhaled softly through his nose, eyes gleaming like someone had flipped a switch inside him. The air in the room changed. Not colder, heavier, as if something long dormant behind that wall had just shifted. Not an object, a memory. Daniel stood and signaled toward the door, calling for a technician to bring wall sensors and scanners. While waiting, he skimmed the file labels across the cabinet. INT, RET 4B, Echo Test N, Subject 09, ADJ, and one box with no label, only a simple circular symbol, the same type used on maps to mark undisclosed locations. He gently pulled the drawer open. Inside, a stack of files, handwritten notes blurred in blue ink, a few nameless sketches, and a black and white photograph of a little girl around 6 years old. She wore a pleated dress, her hair tied to one side, and holding a small ball. Her face was unclear, partly due to a fold in the photo, partly because the light seemed to intentionally avoid her eyes. Dante, now standing right behind Daniels, growled again, but this time not at the corner. His eyes were fixed on the photograph. Daniels slowly rotated the photo to Dante's eye level. The dog stepped forward, touched the image with his nose, let out a faint whine, then turned, walked back to the door, and sat. No reaction. No sound. Only a strange stillness, like a soldier standing before an old grave of someone they once knew. And Daniels understood. That look, that retreat, that silence, it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The dog couldn't speak, but his behavior said it all. I've seen her, or I was with her. No one knows how dogs remember, or how much. But Daniels, after years beside Dante in war zones, knew this. What takes humans a lifetime to grasp, a dog sometimes finds in a breath, a gaze, or a heartbeat. And that room, with its faded files, dried blood, and strange drawings, wasn't just a scene. It was a black box of a memory forced into slumber. And Dante, like a silent sentinel, was calling those memories back to life. Daniel sat motionless after Dante turned away. In the soft yellow light, among crayon drawings and coded files, he felt as if he had opened not just a room, but a portion of the past that the authorities had deliberately buried with time, silence, and willful forgetting. He knew what he needed now: someone who could connect this buried piece of history to what remained in national records. Someone who not only understood the cryptic language of fading files, but dared to face what the system once turned away from: the truth. Daniels pulled out his phone and dialed a contact labeled Riker, retired. 3 hours later, a gray SUV glided silently through the Lincoln Base security gate. The man who stepped out needed no introduction. Riker, former agent of the Defense Intelligence Agency, carried no badge, but his presence alone bore the authority of someone who had seen far too much of what no one should. His eyes were still sharp, but age had settled into his crow's feet. His hair was fully gray, and his gait was heavy. Yet when he entered the sealed room behind the flag, where Dante sat like a statue, Riker stopped at the threshold. He didn't speak, just observed, slowly, carefully. Then his gaze landed on the slip marked TS Unit, Cycle 3A, and the child's drawing of a little girl beside a black and white dog. His shoulders sagged. "I've heard about this place," Riker murmured, almost to himself. His voice rasped with each breath, "but I thought it was buried forever in 1983. Daniels said nothing. He simply stood still, one hand resting on Dante's collar, reassuring both the dog and himself. Riker stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning everything: the tangled reel-to-reel machine, the dust-covered files, the girl's photograph in the drawer. He bent down and lifted a crayon drawing from the pile, a circle surrounded by spiral lines, with a red X at the center. "This isn't just a child's drawing," he said. "This is a visual reflex induction pattern used in the Echolink program." Daniels frowned. "I thought Echolink was just lab-based." Riker gave a joyless smile. "It was theory, yes, but in 1974, a sub-unit received clearance to expand into what they called remote adaptive behavior. They believed that by programming repeating imagery and low-frequency waves, they could not control but steer memory." Dante stirred. He walked a full circle around the room, then stopped behind Riker, the same spot where he had first discovered the torn flag. Riker knelt, meeting Dante's gaze, not as a man looking at an animal, but as two beings who had both heard echoes most choose to forget. "You remember, don't you?" Riker said softly. Dante didn't bark, but he nudged his nose toward the right-hand wall, where a long scratch marred the concrete. Riker nodded, as if an old hunch had just been confirmed. He turned to Daniels, his eyes direct for the first time. "This wasn't random. This room was a memory observation station for children, funded directly by the Pentagon, partnered with a discrete branch of military psychological operations. I heard whispers. I investigated after it was shut down. But the original room? It was never found. Until today." Daniel scanned the room. "Why children?" Riker closed his eyes. "Because children are blank slates, easy to program. They believed that if you could implant memories early, you could create a generation of soldiers with no need for training. Just insert the right memory. And if it failed, the kids would never recall a thing." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Dante, as if reacting to the weight in the air, let out a soft growl, then turned to a corner of the room draped with a heavy curtain. Daniel stepped forward and lifted it. Behind was a dust-covered wax crayon painting, nailed to the wall with rusted tacks. The image was heartbreakingly simple. A little girl standing alone in an empty room, surrounded by giant eyes sketched in charcoal. At the bottom lay a dog, eyes wide open, staring outward. No title, but in the corner, written in faint, uneven handwriting like that of a child learning to write, was a line. "I remember his smell." Riker closed his eyes. When he opened them, his voice was grave. "This is Subject 09. And unless I'm mistaken, this was drawn by the girl herself." Daniels clenched his fists. His breath caught in his chest. He glanced at Dante, still standing like a living statue, guarding not just a room, but a memory buried by those who claimed to protect a nation. Riker placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You think this dog just tore through an old flag?" He shook his head. "No, Thomas. He didn't destroy, he awakened. And if Dante truly remembers, then what we're about to face might rewrite everything we thought we knew about war, about children, and about the loyalty of creatures we once assumed simply followed orders." Daniel said nothing, but deep inside, something broke open, quiet, sharp, and Dante's gaze never left the dusty painting, as if to say, "I've been waiting for this day a very, very long time." Daniels remained motionless after Riker's last words, his gaze shifting between the fragments of memory now visible in the dusty room and the still figure of the retired K-9 beside the child's drawing. In the yellowed light, everything was quiet, the kind of silence that needed no explanation because it had already said everything. Outside, life's subtle sounds carried on, footsteps echoing down tiled hallways, a chill wind whispering through the weathered walls of the old barracks. But as Riker quietly stepped out of the room, he paused at the threshold, looked at Daniels, and said softly, "There's one more person I think you should talk to. If that flag wasn't hung there by accident, then the one who brought it here might be the final piece." Her name was Margaret Carroll, known affectionately as Ms. Carroll, the art teacher at the Lincoln Training Center. A gentle woman with distant eyes, as if always gazing at a world only she could see. On weekend afternoons, people often saw her in the small East Side studio, behind white curtains, painting canvases in cold shades of blue, the color of an unnamed memory. Carol had no close family. She lived alone in a small wooden house on the edge of town, surrounded by abstract paintings and thick books on post-war aesthetics. But there was one thing few knew. The American flag that had hung in the command room, the one Dante tore through, was the only gift her father left her before he died. When Daniels knocked on her office door that evening, twilight had already settled. The last light of day spilled across the wooden floor, touching half-finished paintings with gold. Carol looked up from her sketchpad, her gaze halting when she saw Dante. But instead of surprise or fear, she simply nodded, a gesture so subtle it seemed unconscious. "It was him, wasn't it?" she asked, voice barely more than mist. "The one who tore the flag?" Daniels nodded. Dante sat down beside him, eyes fixed on Carol as if searching for something beyond words. She stayed silent for a long time, then stood and slowly crossed the room to a low cabinet. She pulled out a small, worn wooden box and opened the lid. Inside were faded photographs, yellowed handwritten notes, and another flag, folded in precise military style, the corner rising like an arrowhead. Carol gently touched the fabric. Her voice drifted from far away. "My father, Colonel Harold Carroll, gave me this flag at my fine arts graduation. He wasn't one to express feelings. Throughout my childhood, he was often gone on special assignments. I grew up in Germany, in cold military apartments, where my mother always told me not to ask too many questions." She paused, eyes still on the flag. "He only said one thing when he handed it to me. The truth isn't always told with words. Sometimes you have to paint it." Daniels furrowed his brow. He thought of the paintings Carol hung in the hallways, layered blue strokes, spirals repeated over and over, faceless figures, as if intentionally blurred. He once assumed it was simply abstract expressionism. But now, he wondered, were those suppressed memories finding their way back through her art? Dante suddenly stood. He walked slowly toward Carol. No sniffing, no rush, just one slow step, then another, until he stopped in front of her and looked into her eyes, a greeting from somewhere very old. Carol gently knelt, leveling with him. "You were there, weren't you?" she asked, voice calm and soft, like wind through pine. "I don't remember, but I've always felt like something was waiting behind a wall I never dared to touch." Dante leaned forward, nose barely brushing the back of her hand. confirming. Carol shivered, but not from cold. It was the reaction of someone who'd just reclaimed a missing part of themselves they never knew was gone. Daniels witnessed it all in silence. He asked no questions. As the last light of day slanted through the window, he realized Dante didn't just tear a flag. He was the quiet guardian of forgotten memory fragments. And today, he had brought Carol back to herself. Carol stood, holding the folded flag, and handed it to Daniels. "I don't know what's waiting behind that wall, but if something was hidden beneath the flag, then I brought it here. I think my father didn't just want me to keep it. He wanted me to see something when I was ready." She turned to Dante. Neither of them spoke, but Daniels knew. They had recognized each other, not with words, but through something beyond language, a shared memory, a pain once boxed away and now unlocked. And between them stood a dog who needed no explanation, no understanding, only trust. The air in the room felt thinner after Carol's final words. The flag sat still in Daniel's hands, but what it held, layers of memory, of codes and silence, now spread like mist in the hearts of everyone present. Dante lay quietly at Carol's feet, as though he had completed a small mission, bringing someone back to the place where the past still waited to be named. Daniels and Riker escorted Carol back to the room behind the steel wall, the space Dante had reopened. This time, Carol's eyes no longer held the confusion of their first visit. There was a strange stillness in her gaze, like someone forced to face a painting they unknowingly made long ago. As a child, they couldn't remember being. Riker pointed to the reel-to-reel recorder on the metal table. The tape had been partially restored by a technician, enough to play back, though distorted and noisy. It was now connected to a temporary speaker system. At Riker's nod, a young soldier pressed play. A low, static hum rose. The tape rolled slowly, like the breath of a forgotten era waking again. Then, a voice. Dry, deep, even. "Report. Subject 09 has completed the primary sensory adjustment phase. Neural response within the 2B threshold. Original memory sequence fragmented. Recommend initiation of replacement memory. Western European family variant. Visual encoding priority." Carol froze. Her eyes remained fixed on the machine, but her hands tensed. Her thumb pressed gently into her wrist, a subconscious defensive reflex. Every word, every rhythm of that voice struck like a nail into the coffin of memories she thought had never existed. Then the voice returned. No longer a technical report, but something firm, with emotion. "Begin transfer protocol. I will supervise personally." Carol slowly turned to Riker. "It's him," she said, but didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. The voice on the tape belonged to Colonel Harold Carroll, the father who had once given her a flag and told her the truth should be painted, not spoken. Dante rose, walking toward the tape recorder. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He moved slowly, head low, as though listening to something both familiar and strange. When he reached the machine, he raised his head, not to the recorder but to Carol. And Carol, in that instant, understood something beyond language. She collapsed gently to her knees beside Dante, resting a hand on his back. And for the first time since it all began, tears slipped down her face. Not from pain, not from anger, but from a shapeless grief, like being given back a piece of yourself, only to find it no longer recognizable. "All through my childhood, I dreamed of rooms without windows," Carol whispered, as if to herself. "Every time I painted, my hand drew the same spirals and walls with no doors. My mother once asked why none of my faces had eyes. I couldn't answer because I didn't remember anyone's face." Riker stayed silent. Daniel said nothing either, only placing a quiet hand on Carol's shoulder, a small anchor in a sea of unraveling time. The tape continued. Now a different voice, smaller, trembling, a child. "I don't want to play this game anymore. Can I go home? Can I talk to my dad?" A pause. Then the man's voice returned, Colonel Carroll. Colder now. "Initiate cycle reset. Protocol E The recording ended in a long hiss, as if even the tape itself didn't want to replay what came next. Dante let out a low, brief sound, not a growl, but a breath. He returned to his original spot, sitting before the drawer that held the photograph of the child, the exact place he had chosen when the room was first opened that morning. Same position, same unwavering gaze. Daniel stepped back, leaving Carol alone with the machine and Dante. In that moment, no one dared interrupt the fragile space forming between two beings, one who had been forced to forget, and one who had never let himself forget. And in that room, where truth had once been encoded in voice, in color, and in the science of psychological warfare, something far simpler had been restored, through the presence of a dog, not through words, but through a memory that had never, ever faded. After the final hiss from the tape faded into silence, the room sank into a stillness that had no name. No one dared to speak. Carol remained there, leaning beside Dante, her palm resting lightly on his thick fur, not to check, not as a habitual gesture, but as if reaching for a rhythm from a time she couldn't place with words. Dante, steady as always, did not move. He breathed slowly, deeply, as if anchoring her heartbeat from slipping into a void. His eyes were wide, but not tense. It was the gaze of someone who had waited a long time for a door inside another to open, and now that it had begun to creak, he simply watched. No pushing, no forgetting. Carol lifted her head slowly, her eyes floating through space. But then they stopped. Not at the child's drawing, not at the tape recorder, but at the ceiling, where peeling paint flaked off like skin. Her lips parted. "This ceiling," she whispered. "It's the same as in my dreams. I used to dream of lying under a flickering light above me, paint peeling and—" She swallowed. A small metal pipe running across, tapping ting-ting, like someone striking metal. Riker held his breath. Daniels just watched Carol, as if she had placed her hand on a door everyone else feared to touch. Carol stood up, wavering slightly, and Dante immediately rose too, brushing his body against her side. A quiet anchor. "They weren't dreams," she murmured. "They were memories. I used to lie to my mother about the gray rooms I drew. She asked why I drew that room so often. I said it was imagination. But really, I was just copying a place I had once been kept." She turned to Daniels, voice low as if every word broke a layer of ice within her. "Did you ever see the painting I hung in the east hallway? The one with the spiral wall and the broken light fixture?" Daniels nodded slightly. Carol reached down, picking up a crumpled drawing from the table, the child's sketch with charcoal eyes. "I drew this when I was 7, she said. "No one believed it was real. They said I was drawing metaphors. But I remember it more clearly now. A room with 4 walls and no doors, just a narrow metal slit, where I'd hear the breathing of a dog. And every time I heard him, I wasn't afraid anymore." Dante lifted his head, his amber eyes locking with hers, confirming a memory others might doubt, but he never would. Suddenly, Carol cried, not with a scream, not with anguish, but with the kind of tears that come when someone brushes against the darkest part of themselves, the one they've spent a lifetime painting over in light. "No one believed me," she choked. "No one believed I saw those walls or heard chains scraping metal or felt eyes watching me in the dark. But you did, didn't you?" Dante stepped closer and gently licked the back of her hand, not loudly, not for long, the only way he knew to say, "I remember." Riker came forward, placing a light hand on her shoulder. "Subject 09, he said softly. "Not everyone lived to say that out loud. But you're still here, and if anyone carries the unspoken memories from that program, it's you." Carol didn't respond immediately. She looked down at Dante, then took a small step back, as if needing to see all of him at once. Something had shifted in her eyes. No longer confusion, but a resolve beginning to rise from the ashes of buried memory. "Then I won't run from it," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "If I'm part of this, then I'll paint it back, with everything I've felt, heard, seen. I won't let it be buried again. Daniels nodded, his gaze softening. He knew, in a place built on manipulation, where people were turned into data points and children had their minds rewritten, a single, honest brushstroke could be the start of justice. Dante turned again, moving to the far corner where he had first discovered the dry blood stain. He sat down, staring at the crack in the wall, not barking, not demanding, just waiting. Carol looked after him and exhaled, part release, part apology. Maybe you're the one who kept the truest part of me safe, she said, and if I ever forgot who I was, you were always there, waiting for me to remember. Dante didn't reply, but perhaps his presence alone had always been the answer. As Carol stood silently beside the crack where her memories had just awakened, her hand still near the old drawing, Dante began to move, not like a dog patrolling or sniffing a new scent, but with a kind of nostalgic instinct, as if each step retraced a path through fragments of time only he could still recognize. He walked slowly, deeply inhaling at each stop, until he paused in front of an old wooden chair. The gray paint on its surface had flaked off in patches like dry skin. No one had noticed the chair before. It was just another forgotten object among more notable equipment. But Dante stopped. Then he scratched hard at one of its legs, both front paws digging into the wood, claws scraping with a sharp shriek against the silence. Daniels froze. Carol and Riker both turned at once. "Dante!" Daniels called gently. But the dog didn't stop. His eyes weren't fierce, weren't warning. They pleaded as if begging someone to hear a language made of nothing but instinct and trust. Then, unexpectedly, Dante whimpered, not loud, but trembling. A sound was drawn from his throat like a distant call, echoing from a memory too deep for words. Carol stepped forward, laying a hand on his back, then bent down to study the chair. When she glanced up at Daniels, her voice was barely audible. "This chair looks like the one in a painting I did when I was little. The one with a broken armrest, it's the same." Riker knelt, brushing dust from under the chair. There, a small triangle was etched into the wood, and inside it, C9. "That's not a serial number," Riker muttered, his eyes darkening. "It's a behavioral marker used to sort children by emotional profiles. C9 meant high emotional bonding with living creatures." Carol looked down at Dante, whispering, "You remember I used to sit here, don't you?" Dante didn't whimper again. He took a deep breath and moved beside an old circular film projector in the corner. As Daniels reached out to examine it, Dante let out another sound. A low growl this time, but not angry. It was charged, thick with emotion. His eyes widened, pupils dilating. His body trembled slightly, as if something unseen had just swept through him. Daniels knelt, placing a hand on the corroded metal casing of the projector. No heat, nothing unusual. But when he pressed his ear against it, he heard a faint ticking, like an inner mechanism still moving, silently, without power. "This device," Daniel said slowly, "it might not be just a projector. It may have emitted encoded light, not visible to adult eyes, but capable of triggering images or sensations in children or animals." Riker nodded slowly, his gaze tightening. Echolink tested a technique called deep light conditioning, programming emotions through flickering patterns. To normal people, it's just light. But for developing brains, or intuitive species like dogs, the effects could be permanent. Carol stepped closer. "If I was here, and Dante was forced to watch what I watched, then maybe what he's reacting to isn't the object, but the emotion tied to it." Dante now sat, staring directly into the rotating spindle of the projector, as though seeing something no one else could. His eyes glistened, not from pain, but from remembering. A kind of memory no human language could fully name. Daniel said nothing. He quietly knelt beside him. He laid a hand on Dante's neck and felt the beat beneath his fingers. Faster than usual, but steady, alive, like a heart stirred by something just beyond reach. He whispered, "You're not just remembering. You're leading us, aren't you?" Dante turned to look at him. No bark, no growl, Only that gaze, deep and full, as if behind those eyes lay 1,000 rooms, children's cries, flickering lights, and the sound of Carol's breath from long ago, all echoing back in the eyes of a creature that had never, ever forgotten what mattered. Dante's strange reaction to the old objects stayed with Daniels long after, enough that he decided on a bold next step, bringing in Shadow, the former K9 partner who had once trained alongside Dante. No one knew for sure whether the time apart and decommissioning had dulled Shadow's memory of past missions, but Daniels believed that if anything remained unsaid in that claustrophobic room, it would be the dogs who would sense it first. That evening, Shadow was brought into the dim chamber, where the overhead fluorescent light still flickered like the weak breath of a fading memory. The dog walked slowly, each step heavy, as if every scent, every gust of air, whispered fragments of something long buried. A second tape began to play, this time with a different voice, lower, more weary, a man's voice, likely a high-ranking officer. "Prepare Echo Link Cycle. Subject 10 is unstable. Initiate with legacy recognition signal from K9 unit." Clicks of machinery, then the breathing of a child layered over a faint growl. And then, as a prolonged wail echoed through the hazy background, Shadow suddenly let out a sharp whine, his entire body going rigid. Everyone in the room instinctively stepped back. Shadow's jet-black coat bristled. His eyes flashed red, lips curled in a fierce snarl, as if yanked back into a time only he and Dante remembered. Investigators moved to restrain him, but Daniels motioned for them to stop. He looked at Dante. The older dog's eyes never left Shadow, but they weren't fearful, not guarded, calm, as if he was waiting for something. Then, in the thick silence, Shadow suddenly stopped. His ears drooped, his head bowed. He made no sound. His body trembled like he'd just relived something too much for the mind to hold. Then, slowly, he stepped forward toward Dante and lowered himself into a deep bow at his feet, a gesture reserved only for the highest-level command protocols in classified missions. Dogs are trained to do that only when they recognize a commanding entity. No one spoke. Only Daniels whispered in disbelief. "He remembers. He still remembers." Dante's deep, knowing eyes did not look at Shadow. Instead, they turned toward the rusty film projector in the corner, as if both dogs were now remembering the same signal, the same task, the same unfinished mission. Riker, who had lived through Cold War operations, quietly pulled a folded sheet from his jacket. It held a code, a special identifier for Unit TSK-9-E. He looked at Daniels and murmured, "I've seen this before. They trained dogs to respond to low-frequency audio signals, not for scent, but for encoded reaction. Do you understand? They programmed the dogs as living memory relays." Daniels nodded slowly. He didn't just understand. He was watching it happen. Dante and Shadow, two animals thought long gone from war, now revealing themselves as keys to a deeper vault. A layer of synthetic memory is not only buried in humans, but etched into the most loyal beings beside them. And then, to end the surreal encounter, Dante walked to the steel door at the back of the room. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply stood there, turned his head toward Daniels, and in his eyes was something more than instinct. It was an invitation. Daniels understood. They hadn't reached the end of this room. And once again, it was Dante who heard the voice beneath the dust, the call of truth. The steel door at the end of the room remained shut, but ever since the moment Shadow bowed his head before Dante, something intangible had shifted. A boundary, invisible but deeply felt, had moved. No one on the team questioned anymore that every direction Dante took them had meaning. This wasn't instinct. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the awakening of memories buried far too deep beneath a perfect disguise. The very next morning, Carol requested to visit the center's old archive, once a makeshift art studio, before the barracks were converted into a community center. No one else had paid attention to the place. A low-ceilinged, musty room coated in dust, storing hundreds of unnamed paintings and sketches from a decade's worth of casual workshops. Dante came with her, this time without a leash. Carol walked slowly, her eyes scanning each dusty corner, each wooden rack overflowing with faded canvas. Something urged her forward. Not a clear memory, but the feeling that someone had hidden something important in the most cluttered, overlooked place. And then, as she reached the third rack from the window, Dante froze. His entire body tensed, as if struck by a silent current. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, but his nose dropped, and his eyes locked onto a square, aged painting almost entirely covered in canvas. To Carol's astonishment, Dante suddenly jumped up, placing both front paws against the rack. With a swift, purposeful pull, he tore the bottom right corner of the canvas, not randomly but precisely, as if he knew exactly what was hidden behind that layer. The fabric ripped. Paint flakes peeled like dried skin. And behind it, a small recessed cavity in the wall, just large enough to conceal a box, placed there deliberately. Carol froze. Her hand trembled as she removed the painting from its frame, revealing a military-grade black steel box, roughly the size of a notebook, the kind used in off-record tactical operations. Riker was called immediately. The moment he saw it, his face darkened with tension. "This is an emergency recording device," he said, examining the box. Only commanding officers had the clearance to store something like this independently. Carefully, he opened its triple-tiered lock. Inside, padded in black velvet, lay a small, faded reel of tape with a handwritten label in red ink. Subject 09, Cycle 4, Phase Induction. The air in the room seemed to stop. Carol slowly sat down, her eyes fixed on that label. She needed no confirmation. Subject 09, the code spoken in the first tape, was no longer a symbol. It was a name once assigned to a part of her that had been stolen before she ever had a chance to claim it. The tape was played on sight. The monitor flickered. Grainy black and white footage emerged. A bare room. A wooden chair bolted to the floor. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7, was led inside, hair in pigtails, wearing a gray dress. She sat without resistance, following silent commands. No one in the room dared breathe as a flashing light from the ceiling began to pulse over the child's face. Then the girl looked up. That face, those eyes, that brow, the look of fear, then emptiness. It was uncannily Carol. Carol brought a hand to her mouth, eyes wide, frozen. "That's me," she whispered. "But I've never remembered being there. At least not in any memory I have." Dante sat by her feet. He didn't look at the screen. He only looked at her, not with panic, not with worry, but with the quiet light of a creature who had always known, and now waited, patiently, for her to catch up. On the screen, the tape continued. The girl was shown fabricated family photos. A simulated voice called her by another name. Every time the light pulsed in a specific pattern, her eyes changed, resistance faded. She fell silent, then nodded to commands no one had spoken aloud. Riker turned to Daniels. His voice was low, hoarse. "There's no more doubt. They didn't just change memories. They rewrote people, and she, Subject 9, is one of the last who survived to tell the truth." Carol didn't move. Her hand remained on Dante's head. His breathing was steady, grounded, like an anchor holding her in place while the storm of memory pulled everything else away. And in that cold, grayscale room shaped by decades-old footage, the truth no longer belonged inside the black box. It had stepped out, and it was breathing, in sync with those who had never forgotten. When the screen finally went dark, the room fell into a silence so deep that even breathing felt intrusive. Carol didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the spot where the black box had been opened, as though inside it wasn't just a videotape, but a complete replica of the childhood years stolen from her without warning. Her hand rested on Dante's headlight, steady, like the last thread tying her to the present. Dante didn't move either, but his ears twitched slightly, as if sensing that Carol's heart was beating to the rhythm of memory about to rupture. It was Riker who finally broke the silence. He stood before the group, all of them dazed as they'd just awoken from a fever dream, and with a trembling hand, he pulled from his coat a stack of aged files, their edges frayed, paper yellowed by time. He set them down on the table and opened them like a teacher preparing to deliver a lesson no one wanted to hear. They called it Echo Link, Riker began, voice dry like the paper in his hand. A program developed in the final years of the Cold War, combining combat psychology with audio-visual signal technology. The original idea was simple. If we could direct a soldier's reflexes in battle, why not steer their emotions too? Daniels frowned. Are you talking about hypnosis? No. Riker shook his head. His eyes were colder than usual. Hypnosis requires consent. Echolink doesn't. It bypasses the conscious mind entirely, working directly on reflex circuits, especially in those who process emotional stimuli rapidly, like combat dogs or children. The room went still again. Carol exhaled. Barely a breath. I feel like I'm not myself, she said, barely hearing her voice. Riker turned to her. Because part of you was rewritten. Echolink doesn't erase memory the way people think. It buries the original deep, and then overlays new experiences using light, sound, and controlled imagery, flashing lights, repetitive vocal commands, synthetic family photos. A feeling of safety is encoded into command structures. And for dogs, whistles, blinking lights, scent signals. Daniels looked between Dante and Shadow. These two. We're both test subjects, Riker finished. I remember their numbers. Dante was part of the first wave subjected to central emotional response protocols, a kind of emotional steering via heartbeat syncing and visual patterning. Shadow was the upgraded version, trained with programmed voice cues and spatial light response. They were designed not just to follow commands, but to react to scenarios in pre-coded ways, as if no human handler was needed anymore. Carol clenched her fists. And they tested this on children? Riker didn't answer. Instead, he opened another file, this time a neural mapping chart showing two diagrams, one of a canine combat dog's brain, the other of a 6 to 8-year-old child. The regions of reflex activation overlapped disturbingly. So, he said softly, if a child could be conditioned to react to a signal, so could the dog. And if both were trained to respond to the same stimuli, they became mirrors, no language, no training, just the right trigger. Dante shifted slightly, laying his head gently on Carol's knee, reinforcing the invisible bond between two beings tied together by something neither of them had ever consented to. In his eyes, there was no blame, no fear, only silent understanding, as if he too had once followed those signals, those lights, and now wanted only to protect what was left untouched. Carol lifted her head. Her eyes were red but steady. If I was Subject 09, that doesn't define me anymore. I'm not a number. I'm me, and Dante wasn't there to control me. He was there to hold on to the part of me they couldn't reach. Riker nodded, closing the file like he was sealing away a dark chapter. And maybe, he said slowly, Dante is the last witness who can testify to all of it. Daniels clenched his jaw. Then we bring this to light. We don't let beings like Dante and Carol stay shadows of a project that should never have existed. In the corner, Shadow moved closer to Dante, nudging his head against Dante's neck. Not as a subordinate, but as an equal. No more training, no more confusion. Just two dogs, once programmed for service, now standing together, finally free to be understood. After the revelations about Echolink had shattered everything they thought they knew about memory, identity, and freedom, Carol turned to the one thing she could still trust, painting. Her hands were still unsteady, her mind was still fogged, but she sat beside the dusty window in the old art room, where the fading afternoon light pooled in silence. Before her, a blank canvas. Beside her, Dante, lying still, eyes wide open, as if he too was watching each stroke take shape. Carol no longer tried to think. She let the brush move, letting images from her dream the night before bleed into the canvas. There was no plan, no composition, just fragments returning, more vivid than ever. She saw a little girl, small frame, braided hair, sitting quietly beside a black and white dog with wild, gentle eyes. Behind them, pale gray concrete walls, no windows, light falling from above in a blur, like a memory on the verge of fading. And beneath them, nearly erased in faint, deliberate letters, 4U10. Carol stopped. She felt a chill, like a fog had passed through her skin. She didn't know why she wrote it, or if she'd ever heard it before, but at that moment, it entered her mind like a whisper from a voiceless room. Dante lifted his head just as Carol finished the final brushstroke. He froze, then let out a low, drawn-out whine, not loud, but persistent, a sound that seemed to rise from the deepest layer of his memory. His whole body tensed. With his nose lowered, Dante crept forward in slow, careful steps toward the painting. His eyes locked on the image of the little girl as if he didn't just recognize her, but recognized himself in her presence. Carol set her brush down and gently knelt beside Dante, her hand trembling slightly as she reached toward the part of the painting where faint letters had emerged. 4U10, she repeated softly. What does it mean? At that moment, Riker walked in and stopped cold when he saw the painting. His face went pale. He stepped closer, bent down to examine the image, and his expression hardened like someone staring straight at a ghost. That's not some random code, he said slowly. 4U10 stands for 4th Unit, Subject 10. It was the 4th experimental group, the one where Echolink moved beyond emotional manipulation and into behavioral reconstruction. Carol looked at him, then back at the words, her eyes wide, as if she'd just opened a gate to something dark and buried using her own hands. So the girl in the painting. Could be you, Riker interrupted, or someone else who shared your program. But with that black and white dog beside her, chances are that's the first version. Subject 10. And if that's true, then that dog is the earliest surviving witness of the most dangerous part of the entire experiment. Dante didn't move, still staring at the painting. Then, suddenly, he turned his head sharply toward the back door of the studio. He whined again, this time lower, longer. The sound didn't carry anger or fear, but something more primal. A call, like a signal from the past echoing back into the present. Shadow, who had been resting in the hallway, rose to his feet. His ears perked up. Without a word, without a signal, he began walking toward Dante. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't a command. It was reflex. A response born from something deeper than training, triggered solely by Dante's gaze and tone. Daniels entered just then, his face tight with concern. "What's happening?" he asked. Carol stood, pointing to the painting, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's reacting to it. To the girl. To those letters." Dante turned again, looking first at Daniels, then at Carol, then directly at Shadow. Their eyes met in a charged, strange triangle. And in that quiet moment, it felt like scattered fragments of a truth long buried had just begun to fall into place. No one spoke, but all of them knew. Something had just been opened. And that third painting, no explanation needed, no analysis required, was the key to a door that had never, until now, been given a name. The inscription 4U10 in the painting didn't just trigger a buried memory in Dante. It opened a hidden vein leading to data never filed in any official system. Riker, with the intuition of someone who had once touched records deliberately buried, suggested returning to the room behind the flag, the place where everything began. He recalled a dark corner beneath a cracked concrete floor, where he once found a sealed, empty compartment. At the time, there had been no reason to dig deeper. Now, everything had changed. That afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the narrow window of the old command room, Riker, Daniels, and Carol returned to the very spot where Dante had first torn down the flag. Shadow walked close to Riker's heels, while Dante led the way, his stride steady and deliberate, as if he knew exactly where to stop. At the corner of the room near the collapsed fireplace, Dante let out a quiet whimper and pawed the ground, right where Riker had remembered. Beneath the aged tile floor was a thin steel plate bolted down with rusted screws. They removed each one, every motion deliberate, like peeling back a sealed fragment of time. Inside was a small rectangular tin box, old, unmarked, except for a single embossed code on the lid. TS-10A. Riker quietly opened it, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of someone standing before a black box, holding the sins of the past. Inside, lined with decaying fabric, was a thin stack of documents. The cover read clearly, Subject 10, FORU Unit, Echolink Project, Phase D. The first page showed a biological data sheet. Female, approximately 7 years old, birth name unknown. A handwritten note added, no response to simulated parental images, high sensitivity to animal reflexes, strong bond with K9-04, recommend transition to synchronous reflex induction protocol. Carol flipped quickly through the pages, stopping at the final note. Scrawled handwriting, barely legible. Girl went missing near Southfield Orphanage, cause unknown. Internal report, the dog detected an anomaly at the east perimeter fence. Unverified. Case buried by command order. No investigation opened. The room fell silent. Carol gripped the file tighter. In her eyes, fixed on that final line, there was no confusion, only something simmering beneath the surface. Anger, pain, and betrayal. Southfield, she whispered. I lived there for a short time when I was 6. After that, everything's blurry. Daniel slowly sat down beside Dante, eyes locked on the space where the box had been. So Subject 10 didn't disappear during the experiment. She escaped, or was released, and sent to Southfield under a new identity. And that dog, Riker added, staring at Dante. K904 could very well be Dante. If that's true, he's the only living witness whose memory wasn't fully wiped, because emotional reflexes are encoded deeper than any protocol. Dante lifted his head, as if fully aware of the weight of their gaze. But in his eyes, there was no fear, only a quiet resolve, like an old warrior who's carried a story no one ever trusted enough to hear. Carol stepped back to the center of the room, holding the documents. Light from the small window hit her face, just as Shadow stepped forward, gently nudging her hand. A quiet but absolute gesture of protection. Carol knelt, resting her hand on the backs of both dogs. I may have forgotten, she said softly, but you didn't. And if this is the last piece I need to remember who I am, I won't turn away anymore. Riker stood tall, his voice firm. We need to track down Southfield's records. If that girl was you, then legal documents, guardianship files, and especially any pet records linked to children might lead us to the final proof. And at that moment, Dante let out a short bark, not loud, but full of weight, echoing through the room like a silent affirmation. The truth would no longer stay buried. The air in the room where Subject 10's file had just been uncovered still clung to a thick fog of unease. Carol held the folder tight, the old pages quivering under her fingertips, as if they, too, were breathing hard. Scrawled lines, crossed-out notes, and that final chilling sentence. The case was buried, felt like a pre-written ending to something that had never truly begun. Dante left the room first. He made no sound, and didn't glance back. He simply walked, each step slow but sure, as if some invisible thread in his memory had been pulled taut, drawing him back to a place humans had forgotten. But a dog's heart never could. Daniels caught Dante's glance and immediately followed. Shadow hesitated, his gaze suddenly uneasy, but then he too followed. Carol and Riker fell in behind, wordless. There was something in Dante's eyes that no one could ignore. Like he'd walked this road before, or had waited all this time for someone to walk it with him. They left the command post, crossed crumbling buildings, and passed the leaf-littered athletic field. Rain from the night before had softened the ground. Footsteps sank into the earth like echoes of a time long frozen. No one spoke. No one needed to. They simply followed Dante, as one might follow a priest into a sanctuary. Silent, reverent, sensing they were about to face something sacred and terrifying. After nearly 30 minutes of leaving through forgotten areas, they arrived at an overgrown clearing. No signs, no fences, no visible structures. The land was uneven, as if once tilled, then abandoned. Weeds reached waist height, tangled with dry branches and debris. Trees grew wild and unaligned, clear signs this place had been left untouched for years. Dante let out a quiet growl. Not loud, but enough to stop everyone in their tracks. He moved slowly toward an old elm tree with low-hanging limbs and gnarled roots jutting out like skeletal fingers gripping the past. And there, beneath the dead leaves and thick moss, was a rusted storm drain, nearly buried. Daniels crouched down, brushing the leaves aside, and froze, staring at a faint, hand-carved word still visible. For you 10. Carol dropped to her knees beside him. Her hand trembled as she touched the letters, not because they were a clue, but because some part of her had seen them before. "I've seen this," she whispered. "In dreams, since I was a kid. The drain, the letters, and a light from above." Only then did Shadow approach. But just a few steps away, he stopped cold. His whole body began to tremble violently, not from cold, not from fear, but as if memory itself had slammed into his nerves, electrifying them with unbearable intensity. He backed away, ears flattened, eyes wide. Gone was the calm confidence of a canine warrior. Shadow was now a creature being crushed by something unnamed. Dante didn't move toward Shadow, nor did he signal. He simply stood by the drain, eyes fixed on Carol, as if waiting. Not for an order, not for confirmation, but for permission. A sign that she was ready to look down, into the place where every wound in her soul had begun. Riker stepped forward and shone a flashlight inside. The tunnel wasn't large, less than a meter tall, lined with old concrete, damp walls, moss, and standing water. But it was an escape route, just enough for a child and a dog to crawl out through the night. Southfield had 3 exits, he murmured. 2 were sealed. This one was never on the official schematics. Daniels nodded, eyes fixed on the deep dark below. If Subject 10 escaped, this was the path. Carol stood, her eyes lit with a quiet fire. And I might be that girl. Dante stepped forward, placing one paw on the edge of the drain. Calm, unwavering, like one who had made a vow to time itself. He didn't bark or growl. He simply stood there, because this place was the missing piece he had waited a lifetime to reclaim. Shadow edged close to Carol, still trembling, but no longer retreating. Maybe he didn't want to remember. Maybe he was fighting against data that had been erased. But when Carol placed her hand on his back, the shaking softened, as if in that touch, a fragment of memory had finally found a place to rest. Beneath their feet, the old drain yawned like a scar that had never healed, but also the only passage back to where the truth lay, silent in the dark. When the entrance at the mouth of the drain was uncovered, Riker sent an urgent report to the FBI, along with the Subject 10 file exhumed from the room behind the flag. Just 3 days later, black vehicles bearing federal insignias arrived in Southfield, rolling quietly over wild grass and under the shadows of rotting trees, as if time had never moved on. They weren't there for a new case, but to shed light on a ghost the system itself had created and tried to forget. The morning began with cold wind and ground-level fog. Dante stood still, his gaze unwavering, as if he already knew what was about to be revealed. When the survey team's ground-penetrating radar detected an odd, hollow space near the northern area, once a playground, Daniels turned to Dante. No surprise. He had already been standing there, right on the slight depression in the soil, silently waiting for human hands to touch the old wound. An hour later, the earth had been cleared. Beneath layers of time-worn dust lay a rusted metal hatch covered in moss. The lock had long since broken, but the edges remained sealed, as though no one had ever entered, or had ever been allowed to leave. Daniels pried at the edge with a crowbar. A faint screech, like metal clawing at fear, cut through the air. When the hatch finally lifted, the smell of mold, damp soil, and something older than loneliness poured out, flooding the space like the breath of the past itself. A rusted ladder descended into the old bunker. Each rung groaned like the sob of a place long forgotten. Carol was the first to descend, following Riker and Daniels. Flashlight beams swept across concrete walls, revealing a cramped, low-ceilinged space without windows. A single round bulb dangled from a frayed wire overhead, flickering slowly, like the heartbeat of someone fading. But what made them hold their breath wasn't the air. It was the drawings covering all four walls. On the flaking plaster were crude sketches drawn with charcoal, chalk, dirt, even fingerprints. A little girl with thin hair and round, black, pupil-less eyes clutched the collar of a dog, unmistakably resembling Dante. Behind them loomed a massive closed gate, wrapped in chains. Each chain was labeled in capital letters: FEAR, SILENCE, FORGOTTEN, IHAVENONAME. Carol stepped closer, her fingers grazing the gate illustration. Goosebumps rippled across her skin, not from cold, but from a strange sense of familiarity. She had seen this before, drawn it when she was just a child, never understanding why she dreamt of stone walls and the sound of a dog panting in the night. Riker crouched in a corner where a rotted wooden box peeked out. He opened the lid. Inside was a small, fabric-bound notebook, thick and tattered at the edges, as if hastily hidden and accidentally torn. Daniels took it and blew off the dust. When Carol opened the first pages, the room seemed to hold its breath. The handwriting was jagged and erratic, crossed out in places, but every word pulsed like dried blood on paper. I don't have a name. They said I don't need to remember it. They gave me a new one. They gave me fear. But the dog remembers. He remembers me, even when I don't remember myself. I call him a friend. Friend never left me behind. Carol turned the page. The next entry was longer, the handwriting stiffer, as if written in haste. I heard them say, "Don't let her speak." But I talked to my friend with my eyes. One day I ran. He bit through the rope. We crawled through the tunnel. On the other side, there was light. But he couldn't follow. I cried. I drew the gate, closing behind me. She froze at the final line. If someone finds this place, please don't let my friend be forgotten. Don't let him die in the dark. Carol sank to the floor. Her tears didn't fall in torrents. They came quietly, like a stream finally seeping from stone, salty and deep, finding a path after so long. She didn't need DNA testing, no explanations. The drawings, the notebook, the way friend was written, every detail bore the unmistakable signature of the person she once was, now severed from memory. Dante entered last. He didn't bark or sniff. He simply walked up to the drawing where the girl clung to the dog's neck and sat down, head lowered as if remembering the very day that small figure disappeared into the tunnel, and he was left behind. Shadow, still hesitating at the bunker's door, finally stepped in. At first reluctant, he approached the journal, then whimpered softly and collapsed to the ground. His eyes locked onto the image of the girl before the gate, a surprising signal from a dog once believed to have had all emotional reflexes erased. Daniels whispered, "He remembers. Maybe not everything, but enough to know who he was." Riker stood motionless, eyes fixed on the words scrawled on the wall. "I have no name." He knew. The very project he'd once been part of had created these nameless children. because to take away their names was to take away their right to be remembered, to be mourned. Carol moved toward Dante, knelt, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "We're still here," she whispered, "both of us, and we've found each other again." In that underground room, no one spoke further, because in that silence, a place once drowned in forgetting, everything had finally been said. After the final lines of the journal were read aloud in Carol's trembling voice, and after Dante's eyes closed slowly in front of the drawing of the girl hugging the black and white dog, Riker quietly turned to the last page in the Subject 10 file. There, he found a rough sketch, an animal drawn in soft charcoal, its coat shaded with alternating light and dark strokes. Below it, a faded note read, "Finn, connection reflex incomplete." No one in the room spoke, but Carol's eyes lit up at the name, like a spark breaking through the dense fog of memory. That night, Daniels contacted every rescue center in the area, places known to take in strays or dogs abandoned after military facilities shut down. They searched file after file using keywords: black and white, German Shepherd, mixed coat, and no registered owner. After nearly 10 hours, a call from the Michigan State Community Rescue broke the silence. They had a dog that fit. No chip, no name. Found wandering near the woods behind Southfield 2 months ago. The next morning, Carol, Daniels, and Dante set out. When their vehicle pulled up to the small hillside shelter, morning mist still lingered. The cold air made every breath dissolve into the ground. A young staffer led them to the outer kennels, where barks echoed as background noise. But in the farthest pen, tucked behind drooping willow trees, one dog lay alone, back turned to the gate, head resting on its forepaws, like a creature that had long stopped expecting anything. Carol stepped up to the gate, her eyes catching the morning light that streamed through the broken rooftop tiles. The dog slowly turned its head. It was a black and white German Shepherd. Its eyes were still, like a lake covered in fog. Dante didn't bark. He took one step forward, paused at Carol's side, then slowly sat down. An act of quiet submission Daniels had never seen in him before. The dog in the kennel, Finn, didn't rush, didn't bark, didn't tremble. Instead, Finn looked at Carol for a long, long time, eyes searching her as though trying to gather every broken piece of memory and fit them into a picture that had never been complete. Then, without being called, without prompting, Finn stepped forward as the gate opened. Each step was sure, calm, without the skittishness of a wounded creature, but with the bearing of a soldier returning home, finding the one he had once vowed to protect. Carol knelt, reaching out her hand. Finn hesitated for just a second, only one, before pressing his head gently into her knee. Quiet, steady, as if time had never torn them apart, as if that morning at the tunnel still lived in his breath. She didn't cry, not a single sob escaped, but in her eyes was a strange peace, something that hurt, yet healed. She placed her hand on Finn's head, her fingers brushing a nicked ear and patches of prematurely graying fur. "Finn," she whispered, "I know it's you." Dante rose slowly and stepped beside Finn. The two dogs, one light gray, the other black and white, stood close, not growling, not whimpering, just looking into each other's eyes like veterans recognizing mirrored scars. Then Dante dipped his head, subtle, slow, not dramatic, a gesture so small it felt like an ancient rite, a dog bowing to a comrade returned from the memory no one believed remained. Finn didn't bow in return. Instead, he licked Dante's ear, a gesture only seen in bonded dogs, a hello, a thank you, forgiveness, all in one breath. The shelter staff stood still, in awe. No one needed DNA. No one needed memory scans. The dog in the drawing, with his expressive eyes, tilted shoulders, and mismatched nose ridges, was Finn. Carol stood, holding Dante's collar with one hand, and Finn's with the other. "We survived," she said softly. "All three of us. and for the first time in her life, those hazy childhood dreams glowed with clarity. No more subjects, no more no name. She was Carol. This was Dante, and the one who had come back was Finn. That afternoon, when Carol returned to the old archive room in the command building, the one where the flag had been torn to reveal the hidden door to the first secret room, the sunlight through the cracked window pane struck directly upon the scorched corner of a wooden desk. Dante was still beside her. Finn followed quietly, like a shadow. Neither dog took their eyes off her, as if sensing that her steps weren't walking through the present, but retracing a path deep into the final fragments of memory still buried. Carol placed her hand on the last small drawer that hadn't yet been checked. It stuck slightly, but wasn't hard to open. Beneath a layer of rotting paper liner, she found a pale brown envelope. There was no name written on the front, only 3 lines of handwriting in faded blue ink, stiff and firm, like the kind she had once imagined in dreams. You always loved blue. I'm sorry I made you hate it. If you're reading this, it means you've looked behind the flag. Carol sat down, her hand gently gripping the envelope as if afraid it might vanish. She drew out a piece of yellowed paper. The writing trembled slightly, as if the writer had clung to it with the last breaths of their life. She read slowly, line by line, her voice catching in the silence of a room that now seemed to stitch together everything once torn apart. Carol, if you're reading this letter, it means the secret I tried to bury beneath ranks, titles, and the national flag can no longer be contained. And perhaps that's right. I once believed that by staying silent, by boxing up the truth, and hiding it behind the flag I swore to protect, I could protect you, from the very world I helped build. But I was wrong. The truth will not stay buried, and you are the one who opened it, not with power or weapons, but with art, with childhood drawings, with the gaze that dogs never forget. You always loved blue, the color of the sky, of hope. And now, all I can do is ask forgiveness for turning that color into a suffocating memory. Carol sat still, her hand resting on the trembling paper, eyes no longer reading but listening, to the space between the lines, to the sorrow her father hadn't written but had left behind like ash. Dante moved closer, sitting silently at her feet. He didn't make a sound, but his ears perked slightly, his gaze locked on the letter. Finn, lying across from her, rested his chin on his paws, eyes heavy with a nameless emotion, as if he too had once seen the man who wrote those words pass by in the corridor, eyes clouded with guilt. Carol lifted the letter again, reread it, then carefully folded it and placed it against her chest, right over her heart. She couldn't hide the truth forever, she whispered, not in anger, not in blame. But he held on to the one thing that mattered most, his love for his daughter. Then she turned to Dante, her hand resting gently on his head. "And you," she said, her voice softening, "you were the one who brought it all into the light." Dante's eyes at that moment reflected the softest light Carol had ever seen. Not bright, not demanding, just a quiet glow, like a small lamp lit in a once locked room. Finn raised his head and stepped closer, pressing his nose to Carol's shoulder as if offering a sliver of silent memory. In that moment, the 3, 1 woman, 2 dogs, seemed to reconnect a thread that had been severed long ago. A thread of love, of protection, of forgiveness. Riker entered soon after, wordless. He quietly handed Carol a black and white photo clipped from an old file. In it stood Colonel Harold Carroll, her father, between 2 canine dogs. One of them was clearly a young Finn. Below the image was a faded caption. Echolink, project unfinished, emotional imprint unstable, connection successful only with subject 10. Carol looked at the photo, then at the 2 dogs beside her. That connection, she said slowly, was never lost, just buried, waiting to be remembered. And on that day, in the old room, the light through the window cast a gentle line of blue across the floor, like a final reply from a father to a daughter who had redrawn memory with a heart that refused to forget. Afternoon light streamed through the window of the room that once belonged to her father, forming a quiet line of brightness across the tiled floor. Carol sat at the table. In front of her, a clean white canvas. Around her, the old paint set she used to teach children how to draw at the training compound. Her breath was calm, hands steady, no longer trembling like the first times she returned here. The letter from her father still rested in her left pocket, close to her heart, like a quiet heartbeat helping her finish what she had begun. Dante lay beneath the table, his head resting on the toe of her shoe, eyes half closed but ears still alert to every sound. Finn lay near the windowsill, sunlight bathing half his body, making parts of his fur shimmer like silver. The two dogs, witnesses, friends, were no longer lost fragments. They were the heart of what she was about to paint. Carol began her final painting with the color blue, the color she once loved, then feared, and now learned to love again, stroke by stroke of resurrected memory. But this time, it wasn't the lonely blue of night, or the haunted blue of twisted memories. It was the blue of dawn skies, of freedom and forgiveness. In the painting, she depicted a deep pine forest. The trees stood tall and straight like pillars of time leading inward. Dante stood to the left, his gaze fixed toward the horizon like a guardian watching over a world only he could see. Finn stood to the right, head slightly bowed, but no longer lost. Instead, he looked like a being who had finally found where he belonged. Between them stood a wooden door, unlocked, slightly ajar. And behind the door, bathed in gentle light, was a little girl with shoulder-length hair. No collar, no leash, no chains of fear. She had her back turned, walking softly forward. Her figure radiated the kind of freedom no experiment or broken memory could ever erase. Carol didn't use dark tones for the girl. She chose soft white with hints of pale yellow, as if that memory was no longer a cage but had been released. No blood, no chains, no shattered mirrors or stone walls, only nature, light, and beings finally freed from the limits that once held them down. And when she finished the final brush stroke, she didn't sign her name. Instead, she wrote a small line in the bottom right corner, in soft handwriting, like a whisper to her past, not to close, but to open. At that moment, Dante rose, walked toward the painting and stared at it intently, as if recognizing himself in Carol's lines. He touched the painted forest floor with his nose, right where he had been drawn, then sat, front legs crossed, his gaze thoughtful, like a sentinel guarding the threshold of memory. Finn didn't approach. He remained by the window, but he had turned his head toward the painting. In his eyes was a feeling hard to name, not joy, not sorrow, but the stillness of a soul that had descended through every layer of forgetting and finally touched something real. Carol stared at the painting for a long time. No one had asked her to create it, no prompt, but she knew this painting wasn't for display. It was her final word to the years buried beneath silence. When Riker entered, he stood still. He said nothing. He didn't need to. After so many years of service, he knew some stories could never be told in files or courtrooms, only in images like this. Silent, profound, and so true no one could look away. This, he whispered, is the strongest proof that what they tried to forget can still be forgiven. Carol smiled. She stood, smoothed her hair, and looked out toward the distant pines beyond the window. Because I didn't just remember, she said. I forgave my father, them, and myself. Dante stepped close, looking up as if to ask, "What now?" Finn stood and gave a small head shake, his tail giving a single soft wag, as if in agreement. "Now," Carol said, stepping toward her two dogs, "we go find the others, the ones still locked behind doors no one ever opened." The painting remained where it was, uncovered, unhidden, like a quiet invitation to anyone who entered that room. That truth once found and painted with a heart that refuses to forget is no longer a burden. It's a chance to begin again. The news didn't break through an official report or a press conference. It spread most quietly, like light seeping through a crack, from a photo of Carol's final painting, accidentally posted by a volunteer, along with a short caption. "We forgot them, but they never forgot us." At first, there were just a few shares, but within 24 hours, the image was everywhere, across newspapers, forums, and in hashtags carrying the weight of buried guilt. Echolink, Subject 09, Forgive but Remember. Within 3 days, the entire nation was in shock. National TV stations ran the same headline across major networks. K9 Dog Exposes Military Memory Erasure Program. Former Subject 09 has returned. Not long after, a video aired during prime time showing the moment Carol finished the painting, with Dante and Finn silently by her side. 2 dogs, unleashed, uncommanded, standing still beside a woman who once had no name, only a code. That image stopped millions of hearts. In major cities, candlelight vigils were held. Initially, they were prayers for the children used in the experiment programs. But soon, these gatherings became places where people shared their fragmented memories, unexplainable dreams, invisible fears, and feelings of disorientation once dismissed as psychological imbalance. An elderly woman in Vermont said she once had a dog just like Finn. Watching the news, she swore he used to react the same way to certain sounds normal ears couldn't distinguish. A former Air Force officer in Texas called a live broadcast, crying as he admitted he'd once heard the name Echolink, but had signed a secrecy agreement in 1985. Now, he just wanted to say, "Sorry to anyone who was ever turned into a tool." Talk shows exploded. Night-long discussions brought together psychologists, lawyers, veterans, and animal experts, all trying to interpret the meaning of every gesture Dante and Finn had made. No one could deny it. It wasn't the files or the tech. It was the dogs that opened the door to truth. But while the world roared, Daniels declined every interview. He didn't take a podium, didn't stand in front of a camera. On the day the painting was placed into the National Archive, he simply walked Dante around the old barracks, now fenced off to be restored into the Echo Memorial site. Finn followed silently, uncalled, like an extension of memory into the present. Riker, in a letter to Congress, wrote, "If a dog can remember what we tried to forget, maybe its loyalty isn't just to humans, but to what's right." Carol received thousands of letters from all over, from former orphans, young artists wanting to learn from her, and old soldiers who had seen Echolink drift through the past like a ghost no one dared name. And in her small house, living with Dante and Finn, those words weren't applause. They were quiet affirmations that when truth is freed through loyalty and unconditional love, it stops being a wound and becomes a legacy. That night, Carol stood on the porch. Finn lay by her feet. Dante rested his head on the wooden step. The moonlight spilled gently across them. No one said a word. They had reached the truth, and through the dog's eyes, the world had finally seen it. After a long day immersed in relentless news and emotional waves sweeping across the country, Carol fell asleep in the modest attic room of her home outside Lincoln. Below the creaky wooden floor, Dante curled up by the fireplace. Finn lay near the window, eyes half closed, ears alert, listening for a signal only the heart could hear. Carol rarely dreamed. Since her childhood had been torn by images with no clear origin, she had taught herself not to believe in dreams, or at least not to let them disturb what little she had managed to piece back together. But this time, the dream didn't come as terror. It came like breath. In it, she stood in a forest. Not the pine woods she had painted before, but a deep, dark forest, with moss-covered trunks and a sharp wind cutting through the trees. There was no moon, yet everything was visible, the trembling leaves, the soft, damp earth beneath her. And then, from the shadows, A figure stepped forward. A girl, grown now, but the eyes, the brow, the posture, undeniable. It was her, the girl from the painting, Subject 10. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, looking at Carol with a gaze both familiar and distant, as if they had once shared a piece of soul. Beside her was Finn, calm and still, head tilted, tail slowly wagging, as if to confirm. This dream was real. Carol stepped forward. The girl raised a hand. Wait. Then, like fog dissolving in the morning light, they vanished. Carol woke with a start, shirt soaked in sweat, but her heartbeat was steady. There was a strange stillness around her, not as though she'd escaped a nightmare, but as if she had just returned from something real. Dante was already sitting, watching her closely. Finn stood in the hallway, silent, waiting. Carol sat up, ran her hand through her hair, and said, not exactly to the dogs, but as if speaking to something inside her, "She's still alive." Her voice carried certainty, as though she had heard it directly from the girl herself. Riker came the next morning after Carol called. Though used to the unexplainable, even he was surprised by the intensity in her eyes. "It's not just intuition," Carol said. "It's something beyond memory. I feel it, like breath. Subject 10 isn't buried. She's out there, waiting to be called by name." Finn stepped forward, resting his head on her lap. He didn't whine, didn't wag his tail. He simply looked up at her, eyes reflecting the same figure Carol had seen in her dream. It wasn't agreement. It was recognition. Finn had been there. Finn remembered. And now he wanted to go back. Dante moved from his corner, walked over, and sat next to Finn. For the first time since the two dogs were reunited, they both bowed their heads, like a quiet ceremony marking the beginning of a new journey. Carol stood and turned to Riker. "I want access to every file on the children classified under Echolink, even the sealed ones." Riker looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll find her. If Finn remembers, we will find her." That afternoon, Carol walked into the meadow behind the house. The fading sun stretched golden trails across the grass. She sat down, sketchbook in hand, and began to draw the girl from her dream, not from twisted memories or fear, but from a complete picture. For the first time, Subject 10 wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. Behind her, Dante lay guarding her, eyes closed, ears alert. Finn stood a few steps away, the wind lifting his fur like a flowing coat. Carol's dream had planted a seed. And all three, Carol, Dante, and Finn, knew the journey was far from over, because those once forgotten will only truly be free when their names are called, not by numbers, not by files, but by love, memory, and a loyalty that never burned out. In the days following Carol's strange dream, something in the air around the old training compound began to shift, quietly but unmistakably. No one said it out loud, but from Finn to Dante, from the look in Riker's eyes to the heavy stillness in Carol's walk, there was a shared sense of waiting, as if something was drawing closer, not from the world outside, but from a memory regaining shape from within. That night, Daniels was on solo duty at the old administration wing. The sky hung gray like ash, the air eerily still. Dante lay at his feet, not in deep sleep as usual, but breathing evenly, ears twitching now and then in response to sounds only a dog could hear. Near midnight, as Daniels finished the final line in the duty log, he looked up, almost by instinct, toward the window across the room, and for a brief, frozen moment, his heart clenched. Across the yard stood a young girl, thin and still, hair loose, her face partially hidden beneath the hood of a storm-gray sweatshirt pulled low. She didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there, staring straight at the window as if she had known he would be there at that exact hour. But what rendered him speechless wasn't her stare. It was the dog standing beside her, a large black and white canine, painfully familiar. The dog wasn't leashed, didn't bark, didn't turn its head. It simply stood shoulder to shoulder with the girl, and its eyes reflected the dim yellow light from Daniel's office, like two small mirrors glowing in the dark. Daniel stood up quickly, gaze locked. He called out, "Who's there?" but received no answer. Dante had risen too, now standing firmly beside him, not growling, not barking, just tense, his eyes fixed on the same spot outside. Daniel stepped toward the door, his hand settling on the cold handle. Every part of him pulled between logic and instinct, but the old hand gripped the latch and swung open the heavy wooden door. A rush of cold air hit him, carrying the scent of damp pine and distant smoke. The yard was empty. No one there, only a faint depression in the grass, as if someone had stood there a long time. And in the thread-thin glow of a waning moon, Daniel saw the smallest, most heartbreaking detail: a single dog paw print next to a child-sized shoe print, far too small to be Carol's or any staff members. He knelt, fingertips brushing the still clear mark in the soft earth. Inside him, a stretched thread of memory pulled tight and unspooled like an old reel of film. Finn. That gait. That silence. That look. There was no mistaking it. But who was the girl? He turned back. Dante remained at the doorway, not moving forward, just watching him with eyes alert in a way Daniel's hadn't seen in years, as though the dog had sensed the visitor long before Daniel's had. Quietly, Daniel's closed the door, didn't lock it. He returned to his desk and wrote a single new line in the duty log. The girl from the dream is no longer in the painting. She came. She's not ready to enter, but she stood right there. Dante returned to his place, but this time didn't lie down. He sat upright, eyes locked on the window, unwavering. Outside, the wind still blew through the trees, carrying the soft rustle of the night. But for Daniels, from that moment on, it wasn't just wind. It was a signal, a promise, a knock from a forgotten world waiting to be opened again. Daniels didn't tell anyone about the girl in the hoodie or the black and white dog. But the next morning, as he brewed coffee in the small kitchen next to the security post, Dante suddenly stood up, walked straight to the door, scratched it lightly, and turned back to look at him. The look wasn't a request. It was a direction. Without questioning, Daniels followed. They didn't head toward the forest or the old barracks. Dante led him behind the main training center to a spot where the ground had shifted slightly after last year's storm. There, hidden beneath creeping brush, was a stretch of cracked cement. Something barely noticeable. Dante paused, touched his nose to the concrete, then began to dig at the thin layer of soil covering it. Daniels knelt. Beneath the dirt and moss, a rusted bronze ring emerged, the sealed hatch of an old tunnel or forgotten entryway. He called Riker, and within 2 hours, a small team had assembled. Carol, Finn, 2 security officers, and Daniels. When the hatch was pried open, a stale mix of mold and lead dust poured out, thick as the breath of time itself. Below was a narrow spiral staircase leading into a small underground chamber, no larger than a schoolroom. Yet everything inside was nearly untouched. A metal bed frame, a writing desk, cassette tapes, an old recorder, and a flickering fluorescent light casting pale shadows on the walls. Carol entered first, Finn behind her. But it was Dante who moved with purpose, approaching the tape recorder, pawing gently at a tape labeled TS/11. Riker put on the headphones, pressed play. A voice crackled to life through the static. Subject 11, codename Upsilon, displays high instability, not responding to restructuring signals, recommend relocation from Lincoln facility, destination, Western Zone, temporary designation FORU 11. No one spoke. Carol slowly turned to Riker. It wasn't just me, she whispered. It wasn't just Subject 10. Riker nodded, his eyes dimmed as if he were staring into a part of history that had been intentionally severed. From his pocket, he pulled an old field notebook recovered after Echo Link was shut down. On the final page, a nameless, dateless note. 4U11, No signal response. Memory implant failed. Dante had moved to the far corner of the room, where part of the wall had collapsed. From the gap, a small laminated photo had slipped out. In it was a girl, about 9 years old, with short hair, wide eyes, clutching a thin rope in her hand. No one else was visible. Only the faint blur of a dog, half captured in the frame. Carol picked up the photo, her hands trembling slightly. This girl. The sentence never finished. Finn sat beside her, resting his head on her knee, as if he could feel the wave of recognition and sorrow rising inside her. Riker looked at the photo, then slowly exhaled. Subject 11 wasn't terminated. She was relocated, and if the Western Region tag is correct, she may still be out there. Suddenly, Finn whined, softly but clearly. His ears perked. At the same moment, Dante turned his head, staring directly at the staircase above, as if hearing something beyond human range. No one else in the room heard anything, but both dogs, simultaneously, stood and walked toward the exit. Silent, purposeful, as if someone had just awakened a signal long buried. When they emerged above ground, the western sky was painted with the colors of late afternoon. Carol looked up, the wind pulling her hair gently away from her face. That direction was the last place her father had ever gone. That was where Subject 11 had vanished. And now, it was where they all knew they must go next. As the dim glow of dusk fell across the grounds where Dante had just led the group to uncover the third underground room and the truth about Subject 11, a call came from the federal government office that same night. It wasn't a summons with legal force, but everyone understood. The truth had reached the point where it needed to be called by its real name, before the entire nation. 3 days later, Carol, Daniels, and Riker sat together in the congressional hearing chamber. Behind them were Dante and Finn, permitted to enter not as decorated K9s, not as a gesture of bravery, but as living witnesses, irreplaceable in the uncovering of truth. The room was hushed. Lawmakers, journalists, and national security officials filled the wooden benches, their faces tense. On the large screen behind the dais was a still image, a frame from one of Carol's paintings. The little girl stood before a gate, Finn beside her, and the light pouring down from the sky was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Riker opened the hearing. No notes, no prepared remarks. He stepped into the center of the room, his voice low and dry. You ask why a military program scrapped in 1983 can still shake us today. The answer is, because it was never truly buried. He placed a copy of the audio tape from the third bunker onto the table and continued. Echolink wasn't just about behavior control. They didn't experiment to make humans or animals forget. They experimented to control memory, to implant fragments that didn't belong, and by doing so, reshape morality itself. Several council members straightened in their seats, visibly caught off guard. But Riker didn't stop. He turned to look at Dante and Finn, then spoke slower. What they didn't count on is that dogs don't just learn through behavior. They feel through loyalty. Dante didn't refuse to shred the painting because he was defective. He responded to a truth his loyalty wouldn't let him ignore. Camera flashes fired rapidly. Journalists scribbled notes in haste. Carol was next to speak. In her hands, she held her final painting, the one with no hidden code, no concealed image. Just a scene of forgiveness. The forest gate open, light streaming in, 2 dogs standing before a returning soul. I'm the daughter of someone who helped design Echolink, Carol began. Her voice was steady, though her eyes dimmed. And I grew up with memories that weren't mine. I used to think I was broken, that something was wrong with me. But it turns out I was part of an experiment, and the only ones who stood by me were the dogs, even when I had forgotten they ever did. Finn stepped forward on his own. No command. He walked to the podium, lifted his head, and gently rested it against Carol's leg. The chamber fell silent, choked by an image too simple to deny. Daniel spoke last. He didn't say much. He recounted the night he saw the girl outside the window, the footprints left behind, and the feeling he called a flicker of justice in the dark. Finally, the chair of the hearing gave a slow nod and said, "What we've heard today isn't classified material. It's living memory. And the most frightening part isn't that technology could erase memory. It's that we once chose to erase truth from history. And it was the dogs, those we thought of as tools, who chose not to be tools anymore." The hearing closed with a standing ovation, not for victory, but for recognition. A crack had opened in the wall of national memory, and it would not be sealed again. As they exited the Capitol, Dante and Finn walked side by side. No leashes, no commands, because what they had done was never out of duty, but out of something deeper, loyalty to what's right, even when no one remembers what that is. Early winter sunlight angled through the old window of the Lincoln Center's archive room, casting beams across scattered pages like an attempt to breathe life back into a generation's silenced memories. There, Carol was writing by hand in a new green leather journal, the color her father once said she'd loved ever since she could hold a crayon. She wasn't writing to document events. She was writing to preserve a feeling. The feeling of Finn resting his head on her leg like an old promise. The sound of Dante's breath just before he scratched at the first hidden door. The moment she realized the clumsy childhood drawings weren't fantasy. They were memory. Twisted, compressed, then buried beneath a flag. In another wing of the building, Daniels was finishing the file on Operation Silent Brush. He sealed it into a dark leather folder marked "Declassified per congressional hearing." Each page was a peeled-back layer of deception, proof of children with altered memories, of war dogs turned into weapons, and of souls stripped of the right to define themselves. When Daniels walked the folder to the archive desk, his gaze was as quiet as the winter wind outside. No one spoke when he signed the form and nodded gently. But inside, he knew. This wasn't the end, because one file remained open. Subject 11. One name still hadn't been spoken aloud. A girl once transferred to the Western Zone, labeled 4U11, then vanished as if she had never existed. No one knew if she was still alive. No one could be sure her records hadn't been wiped from every system. But the traces, however faint, still lingered. Carol's found sketch, the bunker's audio tape, and the way Dante always looked toward the horizon. Finn still stayed close to Carol now, a part of the home she never knew she had lost. But sometimes he stood for a long time at the door, nose to the wind, eyes distant, as if listening for a call, from memories unfinished, from friends still lost. And Dante, older now, slower, but never once turning away from any door. When the light changed in the afternoon, he would raise his head, alert, as if some deep instinct still connected him to someone out there, a missing comrade, a soul waiting to be called home. Riker had left the center shortly after the hearing, but he left behind a small note for Carol. Written in black ink, it read, "What we exposed wasn't meant to close the past. It was so those once forgotten could step into the light, under their real names. Subject 11 didn't disappear. She's waiting, just like every child who was forced to stay silent." The story seemed to be ending, but in truth, it was just beginning again, through a truth finally named. The next morning, a letter arrived at the Lincoln Center. No return address, just 3 handwritten words, "I remember." Inside was a drawing, 2 dogs in front of a pine forest, and a girl in a hoodie, facing away, her hand resting on a gate left slightly open. The story of Dante, Finn, and the forgotten memories may have come to its close, but the truth they awakened still echoes in the hearts of everyone who has witnessed this far. Dogs are not just companions. They are witnesses, living memories, and loyalty beyond anything humans could ever erase. And sometimes, a growl in silence, a bow before a painting, or a paw print in the wet earth is the beginning of a journey that names what no one dared to speak. What if one day a memory erased returned, not through words, but through a dog's behavior, Would we be brave enough to listen? If this story moved you, like and share it, so more people may know the truth that was buried. And subscribe so you don't miss the next journey, where memory, loyalty, and love always find their way back home.